And with that, let me introduce our speaker. Monika Schmid is head of department at the Department of Linguistics at the University of York, where she went, I think, 3 years ago, coming from the University of Essex, where she was also head of department. So she has extensive leadership experience. Her PhD is from the University of Düsseldorf, and she also spent time at the University of Groningen. So it's a very European spanning career. I think you're probably most famous for setting up PowerPoint slides.
I'm supposed to be recording this meeting, I think, but I have no idea how to do that. I'm very sorry.
Sorry. Most famous for language attrition. I think that's one of the big topics. And it sits in the wider space of multilingualism and language contact. But Monika's work on language attrition has attracted quite a bit of public interest as well. I think you had a Spiegel interview. And the Spiegel is really one of the big sort of magazines, the German-speaking magazines, full page like with the pictures. I was very impressed by that. So it's nice to see also how linguistics work actually captures much wider audience than just sort of more narrowly academic audiences. But our talk today is negotiating multilingualism, language conflict in times of war and times of peace. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's sort of gratifying to realize that your it's sort of gratifying to see that your media presence is recognized and that people remember that there was a picture, which was thank you all very much for coming. Thank you so much for the invitation. I think it's a career first for me. I don't think I have ever competed with the final day of the Rugby Six Nations. Thank you all for being here all the same. I hope that people online can hear me properly. If you can put something in the chat, Brescia is yes, monitoring the chat, they can hear. Perfect, and they can see the slides. This is the hybrid experience. I mean, standing up in front of an audience feels very 2019, and I'm actually quite nervous. I can't remember the last time was that I did something like this. All right, so language conflict. If you look pretty much anywhere, so I shoved in the probably there just to kind of give myself a little bit of an out, but basically I think that there I think that there is, nor ever has been, no country, no region, no society that has been ever entirely monolingual. And wherever you look at these kinds of societies where different languages, different dialects, different registers and so on coexist, you will find a kind of universal state of flux and a universal state of oscillation where the perception of the languages that are spoken, the status, the rights of the languages, the rights of the varieties and their speaker, they always fluctuate. They fluctuate between contexts, they fluctuate across time. And very often people take action to promote, to protect, to suppress, to limit the rights and so on. And every one of these actions almost invariably provokes a reaction. And the reaction very often leads to the end state or the kind of momentary state being exactly the opposite of what was originally intended. A very recent example. These are difficult times, these are troubled times. And so good news is something that we always all cling on to. And so I was delighted to see, as I am sure were you, that about 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump gave an executive order that made English the official language of the United States. Now, of course, this was a long overdue step. We were all critically worried that English was being eradicated. And it was a very important step to combat the woke privileges of ASL users, Navajo speakers, and so on. So people who would just simply, we need to support to learn English, rather than pampering to their little needs and necessities. And this is actually something that has been pointed out as something very urgent a long time ago. In fact, it was almost 40 years ago that Geoffrey Pullum noted that making English the official language of the United States of America is about as urgently called for as making hot dogs the official food at baseball games. So, forgive me for this little bit of polemic. It is Saturday afternoon, you're here instead of the rugby. I wanted to entertain and I wanted to wake everybody up. So when we look at multilingual countries, multilingual societies, there are always differences and shifts in the status of the languages that are spoken there. What is their role in education? What is their role in government? What is their role in public life, and so on? And there is, as I said before, a more or less universal historical pattern of really oscillation, where the pendulum swings from support to suppression. It swings from denigration to pride. It swings from stereotyping languages, dialects, varieties as backward, exotic, primitive, or cultured, civilized, etc., towards becoming a positive marker of identity and belonging, and so on. Now, when these things happen, they happen at the level of society, they happen at the level of government, and they affect large groups of people, but of course, they also affect individuals. And there's always this tension between the individual experience on the one hand and the societal experience on the other, because every language, every dialect, every ethnolect that somebody speaks is linked with different aspects of their own experience and different aspects of their own personality, whereas these larger patterns apply at the wider level. Oops, help, what did I do? And so we're looking at something where you have varieties that at the one hand exist in these states of support or suppression from the government, from the wider population, but on the other hand, also play a deeply personal role. So for example, the language that our parents spoke to when we were little will probably retain all through our lives the most strong emotional connections. So they are the language, this is the language in which we perceive emotional expressions to resonate most. Whereas on the other hand, the language that we encountered in formal education tends to be more associated with rational and logical processes. So when the external situation changes, and when the status of one of these languages in the wider society changes and they become perceived in a different way, that can lead on the individual level to very deep conflicts. Now, this links up with the concept of collective trauma. Trauma as such, and particularly collective trauma, is the reaction that a group of people have to sudden and catastrophic events that change or even destroy the fabric of society. So events such as war, genocide, pandemics, environmental disasters, and so on. And these traumata produce psychological responses. It can be anxiety, it can be avoidance or suppression, and they tend to also evoke the need to make sense of this experience. And now, crucially, when we're dealing with large processes that affect an entire society, we are dealing with meaning making that becomes a public process. So the individual experiences are kind of reinterpreted, reevaluated. They're shaped into a new narrative that then applies at the collective level. The interpretation is applied, the wider interpretation is applied to the individual experience. And so these kinds of traumata can affect people who do not have direct experience with any of these events. One thing that often happens in these kind of processes is that the languages that are involved here become embroiled in these sort of processes. So, for example, when we're dealing with language rejection, we have phenomena such as hate speech, phenomena such as suppression, phenomena where one language or a variety is used to identify people and then target them. So the shibboleth, you're probably all familiar with the shibboleth story from the Bible, from the book of Judges, where individuals who spoke a different dialect were identified as dialect speakers and then slain, killed. And this is not, this is a very common process. So just this morning, there was a story in The Guardian about Syria. Now in Syria, after the 2012 revolution, the Alawites, which is an ethno-religious group that Assad belonged to, they were the ones who were most strongly associated with the crimes of the regime against the people. The Alawites have a very distinct dialect, and now, since the fall of Assad, people who speak that dialect, whether or not they were in any way engaged in these crimes, they suffer. They suffer the revenge actions, and they are being traumatized. They are being slaughtered in the most brutal ways. So these kinds of things. This is where the language that a person speaks can become a marker of something. The language can become a triggering stimulus. So before the fall of Assad, the dialect that was associated with the Alawites evoked a lot of fear and evoked a lot of threat. And then, so that is where the language can become a trigger. But it can also lead then, if the language that you speak is associated with this, it can become tainted to the extent that people lose the ability to express themselves in that language, which of course, if it is the language that you always spoke and the language that your parents spoke to you, really means that there can be a lot of identity conflicts. And there is, of course, also a close link between language and autobiographical memory. So all of these kinds of things can really lead to very, very difficult situations for the speakers. One example of this was a study that I did a very long time ago, in 2002. I looked at Jewish German Holocaust survivors. So I investigated in that study 54 Jewish speakers who had grown up in Germany with German as their only first language. And they emigrated during the Nazi regime to English-speaking countries. And then much later in the 1990s, they participated in an oral history project. And when I came across these interviews, what really struck me was the fact that some of these speakers were absolutely perfect speakers of German. You would not have thought that they predominantly used another language in their daily lives. And with others, they really were no longer recognizable as native speakers. They had a strong accent, they made errors, and so on. So I thought, I wonder what it is that makes one speaker go down the path of maintenance and another speaker go down the path of attrition. Now, the intuitive response to this, everybody always says, is, well, of course, it's to do with how often you speak the language. And that's the interesting thing about attrition. It is not. Nobody has ever been able, no study has ever been able to demonstrate a clear link between amount of use, length of exposure, and attrition. And that was also the case in this study. I looked at various aspects. So I had their free spoken production, and I looked at various aspects of what they told me about how often they had used German, And there really was no link there, no clear impact of use or non-use. There was also kind of no impact of age of migration. I have to say that all the speakers that we looked at in this study were beyond the age of puberty when they left Germany. And we have since tried to find other, of course, there are lots and lots of projects across the world that did oral history interviews of this kind. You can find hundreds of interviews with people that are in German, of people who were above the age of 12. You can find hundreds of interviews that are in English with such people. But when you go below that age of emigration, virtually all of the interviews are in English. So that is negative evidence, and other sort of evidence that we've collected since then seems to suggest that puberty is a turning point. Beyond that, the language is astonishingly stable, and how often you speak it does not seem to make any difference. What did make a difference was I then turned to historical classifications. The period of persecution of Jews in Germany from the rise to power of the Nazis is classified by historians into very clearly delineated phases. In the first phase, persecution was targeted mainly at public life. So there were the boycotts of Jewish businesses, there were limitations to education, Jews could no longer be civil servants, and those kinds of things. In 1935, it became personal. That was when the Nuremberg race laws were announced. So that, for the first time, provided a legal classification of who was and who was not a Jew. So at that point, you could no longer escape this being classified. Until then, it was always at least theoretically possible to convert to Christianity. Now it was a racial thing. This was something that was linked to whether or not your grandparents had been Jews. So that was something that there was nothing you could do about it. And the fact that there was now a legal framework also meant that if you can legally classify something, you can also legally exclude them from things. So that was when all of those petty and not so petty laws came, from Jews not being allowed to use a local ice rink, to them not being allowed to marry Aryans, and so on. The most bonkers thing that I have seen, there's a book that's about this thick, that is only a collection of all of the laws passed in Germany at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, to exclude Jews. In 1943, when you think people would have had different problems, a law was passed that said that that doctoral dissertations written at a German university were not allowed to quote any literature that was written by a Jew. And if it was impossible to exclude this, it had to be listed in a separate bibliography. Yeah, it's not really funny, is it? But I mean, so this was 1935. And then, of course, 1938 was the pogrom. From that moment on, it became clear that physical integrity was no longer something that you could rely on. Your home was being invaded, people were beaten up, people were killed, people were arbitrarily arrested and taken to the camps. And nobody who lived through that experience could ever forget it. And then in 1939, the Second World War broke out. After that, it became virtually impossible to leave Germany. So when I took the interviews and put them into these three phases, the people who left Germany during the first phase, where persecution was sort of comparatively mild, second phase and the third phase, I found a very, very clear change in the amount of attrition that these people experienced. So the longer people stayed in Germany, the lower their proficiency, the earlier they left, the more they were able to maintain and preserve the language. I also found very clear differences. This was really interesting in attitudes. So for example, one of the speakers who left in 1934 reflects really quite nostalgically, I like to read German newspapers, I very much like to watch German TV. In fact, German has remained my mother tongue. The German phrase that he used was es ist halt immer noch meine alte Muttersprache. Contrast that with somebody who left in 1939 and who said, I feel that Germany betrayed me. America is my country and English is my language. So there was a very clearly perceptible pattern here of attitudes affecting language maintenance and language attrition. But what actually is it when I talk about language attrition? What do we actually find? And this was not just in this study, but really in all the work that has been done really since that time. What can happen when you try it is that there is a certain amount of simplification, a certain amount of reduction in complexity, both lexical complexity, syntactic complexity. We find reduced lexical diversity. We find that people tend to converge a little bit more towards not so much less subordinate clauses, but shorter clauses, shorter, you know, German. I mean, German is a wonderful language to write in because every sentence gives you so many opportunities to get things wrong. One of the things that we tend to do, we Germans, we like to do, is we take the verb and we take it apart. We take a finite bit, like the auxiliary or something, and we take the non-finite bit, like the infinitive or the participle. And then if you're Thomas Mann, you shove two pages of text between these two little bits. And what we find is that mercifully, some would say, gets shorter in attrition. So that's the kind of thing that you find. You find, to some extent, an increase of lexical and grammatical errors. However, when I compared the strongest detritus that I've ever come across with the best second language learners of German that I've ever come across, the detritus still come off better. So I have never seen anybody who would get to the point, anywhere near the point, where a grammatical feature would be used sort of at chance. In fact, I have never really seen anybody who made more than about 5% of errors on any grammatical feature. And interestingly, when you look at second language acquisition, 95% accuracy is usually taken as the threshold where we assume somebody to be native-like. So we get an increase of a perceived foreign accent, but there's no evidence for any underlying restructuring, no evidence for any change. And at this point, and you will all ask, but can you still call it attrition? Can we leave that for the question period, please? Let's assume, let's suspend your disbelief for the moment and let me call it attrition if you could. So the knowledge of the first language, or the use, the processing of the first language, is not a stable entity in situations of long-term bilingualism, but the amount to which the first language of any individual speaker will change, or the language use or the language processing will change, is very, very difficult to predict. All we know is that there are no straightforward correlations with amount of use, as we would all expect. And we know to some extent from that Jewish study that I just talked about that traumatic experiences can play an important role, but that has really never been replicated in any other context. So what the study that I talked about just now looked at was the impact of experience on retention after many, many decades. I could only investigate free spoken language use. The thought that you would go out, that you would go and find these people who have been through all of that and say to them, now can I test you, please? That just forbids itself. So I had the free spoken language use, the free spoken language data, and that did not allow me any insight into what happened at earlier stages. How did this come about? How did those people end up after 6 decades where they were? I couldn't say anything about what was going on in the brain, how the language was being processed, and so on. And as I said before, no other study since has been able to establish a link between attitudes and the degree of attrition. So we've just started, about a year ago, we started a new study, which is called Negotiating Multilingualism in Situations of Conflict. And in this study, we are looking at ongoing situations in multilingual countries and regions. We're looking at situations where a national or a regional language is in strong competition with a larger language with wider geographical distribution, and also with a more powerful apparatus behind it. The status of the smaller language has always been in flux in the way that I talked about at the beginning, but has now recently become the target of a conflict. And we're doing 2 sub-studies here. We're looking at Ukrainian refugees, and we're looking at Catalan and Spanish migrants. These are the people that I'm working with. It's a really, really lovely team, and I'm thrilled to have such a wide and really fabulous group of people working on this. And what we're doing is we have a number of instruments. We have a survey on the language background, language use, proficiency, and attitudes of these speakers, which comprises about 90 questions. We give them verbal fluency tasks. Verbal fluency tasks they're very simple measure. We say you have 60 seconds, please name as many animals as you can. Name as many words that start with the letter P as you can. And all of these tasks, except for the survey, are done in both languages. Every participant does them in both of their languages. We have 2 narrative tasks. One of them is a narration. We show them a short clip from a silent Charlie Chaplin movie and say, please tell us what you've seen. And the other is a picture book narration. Those of you who know anything about child language acquisition will have heard about the frog stories. So it's just a little picture book about a boy and a dog and their adventures. And then we have a picture naming task, and that is the task that I'm going to be talking about today. So for the Ukrainian part of the study, we started the data collection a little while ago because we were able to get some funding for Marina Kapas-Romaniuk, who is part of the team. Before the ESIC project started, she was financed by the British Academy Researcher at Risk Fellowship for a bit more than a year. So she was able to start data collection much earlier. She has already finished. She finished about a year ago collecting data from 100 adults. And we're getting ready to start a second phase of data collection to see what has happened to their language proficiency since. For Catalan, we're about halfway through the data collection. We're looking at people, in order to parallel the experience, we're looking at people who left Spain after the independence referendum in Catalonia in 2017. And so we're in the middle of this, and we don't have the data really ready to report as yet. The project looks at whether negative experiences and attitudes can lead to the suppression of a language, and how such a mechanism can affect the accessibility of the linguistic information in the brain. We look at the role of proficiency and dominance patterns prior to the conflict, and we look at the role of experience with and use of the language. So Ukraine is a prototypical situation of what I talked about earlier about the oscillation. So for hundreds of years, the patterns, their patterns of use, patterns of support, and so on, have changed. The context is very, very complicated, but it's gone back and forth between negative stereotyping. So in the 19th century, Ukrainian was by many people seen to be kind of a defective dialect. And there were strong efforts towards Russification of the country. But then, more or less at the same time, there were tendencies for the proud adoption of this language. There were efforts to translate Russian literature into Ukrainian. There were publishing houses. There were other activities. There were educational campaigns and so on. In the Soviet area, the policy was one of official bilingualism, and that is a very, very shortened and simplified way of talking about something that was also hugely complex and would really be at least a talk by itself. But today, the choice of language, Russian or Ukrainian, is very much symbolic of cultural allegiance. So it has gained this component of using Russian to allegiate yourself with Russia and using Ukrainian to show your alliance to Europe and the West. The majority of Ukrainians are proficient in both languages. So I think over 90% of people have quite high levels of proficiency in both of these languages. There are other linguistic minorities. There are minorities that are Polish speaking, there are minorities that are Hungarian speaking, and various other languages. We did not include anybody in our study that belonged to any of these groups. The use of Russian predominates in the east of the country, and in the west, Ukrainian is predominantly spoken. In the most recent censuses in 1991 and 2001, about a third of the population said that Russian was their native language. And this was very much spread out across the country. So the darker these areas are shaded, the more, the higher the proportion of people who said Ukrainian was their native language. And this is the people who say that Russian is their native language. Now, these numbers and this picture has to be taken with a grain of salt, because it is quite common for people who identify as ethnic Ukrainians to give Ukrainian as their native language, even though Russian is the language that they use in daily life, or that was used in the home. So these are the people that we looked at. We asked them, what language was spoken in your home when you were little? And we asked them, what is your native language? Now, these are the people in the west of the country, here on the left of the diagram. And you can see that the median of Ukrainian as a home language when they were little, this is the blue bar here, the median is at 100. So more than half of the people said Ukrainian was the only home language when I was a child, and virtually everybody said Ukrainian is my native language. In central regions of the country, that includes Kiev, the picture, the childhood language is much more spread out. Only about a quarter say that it was definitely Ukrainian, but still almost everybody says Ukrainian is the native language. And it's even more striking here, where really it's only a very small proportion of people say Ukrainian was the native language that was spoken when I was little, but still half of them claim Ukrainian as their native language. The self-rated proficiency, as I said before, is very, very high. In the West, people have self-rated proficiency in Ukrainian, that's close to 100%. So we ask, how well do you understand Ukrainian, from not at all to absolutely, I'm perfect. And Russian fluctuates a bit, but still the median is almost 90. So very confident about their Russian proficiency. This is the center of the country. And then in the east, you can see that proficiency in Russian is, they're more confident in that, but they're still also very, very confident in their Ukrainian proficiency. I couldn't add these numbers into the statistical models because there's not enough variability. Almost everybody says, I'm really, really good in both of these languages. So in the post-Soviet area, the languages, again, became really symbolic of varying expectations and beliefs. There were groups that really wanted an ethno-national monolingual Ukrainian state. There were groups that said, okay, that's all right, you know, Ukrainian for Ukraine is a good thing, but what about all of these minorities? What about the Russian speakers? What about the Hungarian speakers? What about the Yiddish speakers? They also have rights that we need to be aware of. And then there were groups that said, what we need, what we want, we need to be a multilingual state, we need to have an official policy of bilingualism. But the 1996 constitution recognized Ukrainian as the only state language. There were a lot of campaigns promoting Ukrainian monolingualism, but still many areas in the east of the country remain predominantly Russian-speaking. Now you're a Russian speaker, you identify very strongly as Ukrainian, you live in the east of the country, and then it's 2022 and Russia invades. What does that mean? What does that mean for your self-perception? What does that mean for the way in which the language, that is the language that your parents spoke to you when you were little, the language that you've always interacted with your entire family, that language is perceived by very large parts of the population as the language of the enemy. There's a strong shift in attitude. People respond very negatively to you using Russian in public. We find, and this is from our study, what we found was that attitudes to you, so these are the attitudes to Ukrainian, top is positive, down is negative. You can see that they were quite positive before the invasion across the country, in the west, in the center, and in the east, but that after the invasion in all three regions, Ukrainian gained a much more positive view by people. And on the other hand, Russian really went down in people's estimate. So things like, do you feel that Russian speakers are friendly people? Do you feel that Russian is a beautiful language, and so on? All of them really went down. Many parts of the Ukrainian population that were previously Russian dominant abandoned Russian consciously, made a conscious effort to say, I don't want to speak that language anymore, either because of external pressure or because of the way that I feel about it myself. And the Ukrainian language ombudsman said in August 22, there is no such category as Russian speaking Ukrainians. So this was also then an external classification of saying, okay, if you want to be Ukrainian, you've got to speak Ukrainian. And if you're a Russian speaker, you either have to give that up or you have to shift your allegiance. We don't want you anymore. And that had an effect, the use of Ukrainian, again, in the three regions. So in the West, nothing much has happened before and after the invasion. So before the invasion is red, there was a little bit more variance. And after the invasion is the blue bit. So it shifted a little bit. But look what happened in the East here. From really relatively little use of Ukrainian to a massive increase. So what we're looking at now, we're looking at Ukrainian refugees in the UK, and we're looking at how they access their linguistic repertoires. How do they get at the words that are in their mind in both Ukrainian and in Russian? So we did that, that's one of these tasks that I talked about before. We did that by means of a picture naming task. We used 144 pictures. We used only items that were not cognate between Russian and Ukrainian, so that have very different shapes. The words are very different. And so what happens in this task is you see a picture and you say, what's that? A bee, thank you very much. And I measure how long it takes you to say that. I didn't measure it now, you also didn't sign a informed consent. But the crucial bit, the clever bit about this is that this is queued. So the picture is surrounded by a frame. If the frame is, for example, blue, that means you have to say the word in Ukrainian. And if it is gray, you have to say it in Russian. The choice of the picture was counterbalanced. So half the participants have blue for Ukrainian, gray for Russian, and for the other half, it was the other way around. And so what we want to know is to what extent, how fast are people in naming these items in each of their languages. Now, if you look at it across all items and across all participants, we find a very, very small advantage for Russian items. So on average, it takes people a little bit more than 2 seconds, 2000 milliseconds, to say these words. So I'm sure you were actually quite fast there when you said it. But Russian is about 70 milliseconds faster overall across the board. And that is statistically significant at the p smaller than 0.001 level. Now, overall, RTs are a very, very clumsy measure. So what I've done in that picture that I just showed you in those two box plots is the average of over 10,000 accurate and valid trials. So I took out everything that was inaccurate. And I took out everything where they used the wrong language by mistake, everything where they took too long, everything that was too fast, and so on. So these 10,000 trials are composed by 144 different pictures. So each picture is a certain item, and they differ a little bit in frequency, they differ a little bit in recognizability. We try to counterbalance them across participants and items, but still, you know. And 100 participants. So some people are just faster in responding, some people are slower in responding. So I was thinking, how can I come to a measure per individual, per participant, that really allows me to say all other things being equal. You, participant number 53, if I gave you a picture in Russian, what would I predict would your response be as opposed to if you saw the same picture in Ukrainian? So that's what I want to know. I want to know to what extent is one language faster or slower, all other things being equal for this participant. Now, fortunately, I have some very clever colleagues. This is Shane Sloggett, who is our experimental psycholinguistics officer, and he helped me do something which I think is so clever. He helped me calculate, by means of a regression model, the slope per participanted item. And that is just for each participant, we put all the information we had into the model, and it gives me one number that predicts the difference between Ukrainian and Russian response times for this participant. So how much faster or slower is this person in each of the languages? If that value is negative, it means they're faster in Ukrainian, and if it's positive, it means they're faster in Russian. So that is the measure that I've done in the statistical models that I'm about to talk about. I'm also going to give you visualizations, and I used the raw response time, so the milliseconds for the visualizations, because it's just sort of more intuitive to see what is actually going on. But the statistical models, the calculations are based on these slopes. So the first thing we did was we said, right, what we've got here is we've got 100 participants. Okay, they all said my native language is X, but we've seen before that that's not really a very valid way, because the native language is sort of more what they identify with. So we looked at each of these narratives that we had when we did the survey with them. We talked with them for a long time about their experience. And based on that, we said, okay, we have three groups. We have the group that basically when they were little in childhood and in most of their pre-war life, Ukrainian was very clearly, it was the first language they were exposed to. It was the language of education, it was the language of the family and so on. So these are the people that are, for whom we said, okay, these are the people whose native language, whose first language, whose L1 is Ukrainian. And here you can see the response times in Ukrainian and Russian, and you can see there is no difference. So native Ukrainian speakers are as fast to respond in Russian as they are in Ukrainian. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have the Russian speakers. And again, there is no difference. They are also equally fast in the two languages. And then in the middle, we have the people who have really throughout their lives been bilingual, who have experience, who have lived in contexts where both languages have played a more or less equal role. And again, the differences between the response times are almost non-perceptible. And in fact, the statistical analysis shows that what role the language had before the invasion in your life does not affect how fast you are to respond. So what we're dealing with here is really a very, very balanced bilingual population, irrespective of early experiences. Now then the second thing is, this was the thing that I said before, and this is the thing that if you go out in the street and you say you have these two migrants, and they've both lived in the UK for 30 years, their native language is whatever, Polish, and migrant A is absolutely perfect in Polish, and migrant B is really, really doing very poorly in Polish. What do you think the difference is? I mean, you ask 100 people on the street, at least 99 of them are going to say, well, obviously, migrant A will be speaking it on a daily basis and migrant B will not. And that the reality of the research shows that that is simply not what is going on. And that was, again, confirmed by this. So here, this scatter plot shows you on the x-axis, the current amount of use of Ukrainian in their daily lives. So that includes then the other bits that they use are both English, obviously, because they live in the UK now and Russian. How strong, how important is Ukrainian in their daily activities? The people who are here on the left of the chart use it not at all, and the people who are on the right of the chart use it all the time. This is the value of the slope. So remember, negative is Ukrainian dominant, positive is Russian dominant, and this is the regression line, that red line, which is, you know, I mean, I'm used to it by now. My PhD students come with data like that. They sit crying in my office. They say, I haven't anything. That's like, yeah, you and everybody else. So no effect here. It is really interesting to see that, particularly with something that is so, that really tries to tap into processing. What I did find is, so this is not significant, you can see that. What I did find is an effect of attitude towards Russian. Doesn't look particularly dramatically steep here, the slope. It is statistically significant, and it remains significant no matter what other factors and what other measures I try to put in the model. So the more positive the attitude towards Russian, the more they lean on this chart towards Russian dominance. So towards being faster to respond to Russian than to Ukrainian. What that suggests to me is in the context of a really balanced bilingual population that you've seen, is that the people who have a really strongly negative attitude towards Russian are suppressing the language. So it's not that they're no longer proficient in it. It's that they're sort of trying to push this to the side. Now, this is a mechanism that in many other contexts we know and we experience. So, for example, I mean, it's a completely different situation, but I think it is the same mechanism. I studied French at university, and I used to be relatively fluent and proficient in French. And now, about 5 years ago, I started learning Spanish. And I'm really focusing very much on Spanish. Now, what I have to do when I try to speak Spanish, I basically have to put my French in the corner of my mind and build a wall around it and say, go away, I don't want you now, I don't want you to interfere, because of course there's so many similarities between the two languages. And some time ago, I flew through Geneva Airport. I was visiting some friends. I wanted to go and buy some chocolates for them, and I went to the counter, and every time I opened my mouth, and they said, "Do you want to pay by credit card? Do you want a bag? Do you want me to wrap it as a present?" My brain produced "oui," and out of my mouth fell "si." And it was my French, sort of sitting in the corner of my brain saying, "Well, you didn't want me." So you just go and look, you told me to go away, so I'm staying away now. You see how you manage in this situation. I think that's kind of what's going on here, that the effect of the suppression of the language leads people to be slower in trying to unearth it and to get at it again. So to sum up, what I found is I have a really balanced bilingual population with very high levels of proficiency in both languages. And that really extends across all the regions of Ukraine, even though the language usage patterns prior to the war will have been very different in the different regions and the different segments. People tend to be Russian dominant in the East and Ukrainian dominant in the West, and largely balanced in the central regions. But overall, the picture is of a very, very, very balanced bilingual population. As you saw, there was a small overall advantage in naming speed for Russian. It's not really very much. When I look at the relative naming speed, at the advantage that one language has over the other, it is not a function of the childhood home language, nor the language that was dominant prior to the invasion. It is not a function of the language that currently dominates in use, but it is affected by the attitude towards Russian. And it is possible that that is the first step that leads down a similar path that the one that the German Jews that I talked earlier took when they emigrated. So the future steps are to look at all of the other tasks that we've got. We've got the productivity on the verbal fluency task. We are currently looking at investigating free speech is a lot more labor intensive with the coding and everything that you have to do. We're going to be looking at lexical diversity, fluency, and complexity. We're going to conduct the second round of fieldwork to see how this is. I'm really, really curious to see what's happened to this language 2 years down the line. And I want to know to what extent these factors, background, use, and attitude, will affect the accessibility longer term. So what are the conclusions from this? Well, first of all, I mean, this is a little bit bland, but migrants in general, refugees in particular, have very, very complex relationships with the languages that they speak. And events that they have experienced will reflect back onto that language. Where the personal and the collective experiences clash, that can lead to conflicts. And crucially, we need to understand this in order to provide support effectively. What happens in the UK and in many other countries now is Ukrainian refugees come, people say, "Oh yeah, you're Ukrainian, we know that you all speak Russian, so here's a Russian interpreter. Look, we found you an Orthodox priest that can do your, your religious services as you like them. Yeah, he's Russian speaking. Is that a problem?" And so on. So we need to understand, and this is just one snapshot. The same is true for almost all refugee communities and almost all refugee situations. So we have to understand what's going on here in order to be able to provide support effectively. When it comes to attrition, so there are a number of things here. What does seem surprising, unless you've been there and done this in many studies and found it time and time again, is this lack of an impact of amount of use. It has been confirmed, as I said, time and time again. And to the best of my knowledge, there's no study that has ever found a link between amount of use and attrition or lack thereof. Also, there is this, I promised you we could get back to this in the discussion period. If there is a lack of structural deterioration, what actually is attrition? Can we call it attrition? We can discuss whether we can call it attrition later on, but what we see is that the knowledge of both first and second languages, this is true for second languages as well, they don't deteriorate at the structural level. Once you've reached a certain level of knowledge, it stays with you for life if you have maintained it until really the onset of puberty. And the changes that we see in language use, language behavior, language processing, and so on, are, I think, the languages messing with each other in the process of production, in the process of processing. They do not reach the structural level. They do not lead to restructured competence, restructured underlying grammatical knowledge. What that suggests to me, both the fact that it doesn't matter how often you speak it, and you don't lose it, suggests to me that language knowledge to a much larger, we've always known that language knowledge is unlike any other type of abstract knowledge that we have. But I think it is more unlike any other type of knowledge than we thought before. Thank you.